Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody, or probably afternoon now. Amir Metter took a handful of possessions into the water with him. Strapped to his waist, he had a mobile phone and a few memory cards with photos of his family. He also had a few ginger-flavored dates wrapped in cling film. He was scared, but he was pretty confident because he'd been a member of the national swim team. For over 7 hours, he braved huge waves and deadly currents to swim the 4 miles from the coast of Turkey to the island of Samos in Greece. At the other end of Europe, there was Farid, and he towered over a child's bike. He had just bought it for $200 to cycle the 150 meters into Europe. He had decided to take advantage of this loophole in border security between Russia and Norway that allowed him to cycle across the Arctic Circle into Europe. Apparently, Russia does not have a rule. It does not allow people crossing from Norway by foot, and Norway doesn't allow people to cross from Russia by car without the necessary papers, but neither of them had a rule with regard to a person on a bicycle. The Russian-Norwegian border last year saw 4,000 migrants cross, and this was up from just 7 the previous year, while over 1 million people, mainly Syrian, Iraqi, and Afghani refugees, have made the perilous trip across the Aegean Sea into Turkey and onto Europe. And not everybody has made it. These are fantastic stories, but the truth is that there's over 60 million people on the move last year, fleeing poverty and also escaping conflict. They all have their own story. Migration has become one of the biggest global challenges facing us today. It's up there with climate change, cybersecurity, finance, and pandemics. What we need is a global public policy response to tackle this huge movement of people. Supranational organizations, NGOs, national governments, academics all need to come together with new ideas and new thinking. According to Professor Ian Golden, there's a complete lack of global governance when it comes to migration. And by global governance, I mean that institutions that transcend national governments and regional authorities. Now, most of the global institutions we have today were set up in the last century, and frankly, they're found wanting. And some might say they're unfit for purpose. But they are what we have. We have the World Trade Organization for trade. We have the International Monetary Fund for finance. We have the World Health Organization for health. But we've nothing on the same level for migrants. Sure, there are aspects of the UNHCR that deal with the plight of refugees, and also we've got NGOs like the Global Migration Group that bring together some UN branches, but none of them have a global force. So this lack of coordination has led governments to devise their own migration policies. And this has led to increasing nationalistic and xenophobic tendencies, and it also has brought very real social challenges and consequences. Now, some economists would argue that migration only has benefits, and it's the wealthy indigenous people that that make most money with migration. And it's the poor indigenous that are worse off. It's the middle class that can benefit from the archetypical migrant staff, such as cleaners, drivers, and nannies, while it's the indigenous poor that have now to compete with the poor migrants for low-paying jobs, social housing, and other social services. And it's the indigenous poor that feel that the migrants are already on a good deal by being allowed to stay and getting shelter and food. The last thing they want to be doing is competing with migrants for state resources. However, there's another group of economists that see nothing but migration as a great opportunity. It has huge benefits. These are the liberal utilitarian economists who argue that the migration policy should be set to maximize global utility, full stop, and that the gains will far outweigh the negatives. Sure, there'll be some losers, but the vast majority will be winners. The more migration you have, they say, the better off you will be in the long run. The World Bank, which is full of utilitarian economists, has suggested that a 3% increase in the migrant workforce can generate an extra 350 billion US dollars. And if you were to open the border altogether over the next 25 years, the economy would generate an extra 40 trillion US dollars. Now, not all liberal economists would agree that you should open all the borders up, but they do contend that increased migration is needed, particularly to support the aging populations in the OECD countries and in Europe. And it's only through this higher level of migration that the healthy ratio of working to non-working citizens can be maintained. For argument's sake, it's believed that Europe will need about 300 million migrant workers between now and 2050. But the big question is whether the negative popular perceptions of migration will shift enough to allow what is currently politically impossible. Perceptions can begin to change, according to some liberal economists like Paul Collier, by changing the vocabulary that we use. We should no longer be talking about brain drain or brain gain, but maybe brain circulation. When I was growing up in Ireland, we used to have a lot of Filipino nurses who would be coming over to work in Irish hospitals. And we were kind of saying, what's happening to the hospitals in the Philippines? We were getting so many. But I read recently in the same book by Paul Collier that the Philippines have put an awful lot of energy and time into training nurses for export. And far from being a brain drain, they're part of their economic policy. Why is this? Well, because migrants sent home money. Globally last year, or globally in 2011, migrants sent over 370 billion US dollars in remittance, which is larger than the total direct foreign investment that developing countries get, and twice the amount of the official aid that they receive. In fact, it's believed that in Latin America and the Caribbean, 50 million people survive in remittances alone. Social scientists also entered the debate. And they don't talk about utility, they talk about community. And community, they argue, is one of the key determinants of happiness and a sense of identity. They would see it as they would see the growing influx of people with different norms, traditions, customs, and beliefs as maybe having a destabilizing effect on a host society. And it has the effect, according to Harvard economist Putnam, the indigenous people of hunkering down in the face of a large number of migrants. They retreat into themselves. The mass influx produces fear and resentment as each group tries to maintain their own identity, and in the absence of progressive and sustained government intervention, nationalism, racism, and xenophobia will proliferate. And we've seen recent moves by legislators in Denmark, Sweden, Holland, and Germany, not only to restrict the entry of migrants, but to actually expel them from the country. Now, I understand that politicians are only responding to the views of the electorates. But there are crises happening every day in these countries. One example that stands out to me was when a Syrian man arrived in Holland, and under Dutch law, he could bring his wife or family over to be with him. When his wife arrived, it found out that she was 14. Now, this was against Dutch law, and there's another problem between bringing in migrants. Culture, however, is what separates the diaspora from the indigenous. And some cultures are more distant from the indigenous culture than others. The more distant the culture is, the slower the rate of absorption. And the more difficult then it would be able to find a sustainable rate of migration. On top of this, many migrants would say, quite understandably, that they want to keep their own culture. They don't want to integrate into a new one. This can be a problem. And that's when you get hermetic communities, self-contained, cut off from the rest of society. Now, historically, integrating migrants with the indigenous cultures happen in one of four ways. They can assimilate, they can fuse, they can separate, or they can dominate. All narratives come from these four scenarios. Absorption and the flow of migrants are inextricably linked. The rate of absorption depends on several key factors, like the willingness of the migrant to integrate into the host society, like the host society willing to put on language classes or history and civics, promoting symbols and ceremonies of a common citizenship. Incidentally, it's been shown that by learning a language of the host country, you can really increase the chances of integrating successfully into the new society. Now, absorption can take many forms. Australia and Canada, they have a rather sophisticated selection process based on a point system. Other countries like the US promoted integrated schooling, and many European countries have gone for geographic dispersal. Yet if migrants want to stick together to something that is familiar to them, well, this hampers absorption. So then, if you can control the flow, well, maybe you control the absorption. But the problem is, we cannot control the flow. The flow is caused by a grotesquely large income gap between the rich and poor countries, and this cannot be closed and will not be closed for several decades. So in the meantime, you're going to have forced migration for whatever reason will continue apace. Diasporas in various countries will continue to grow, and the present mismanaged nationalistic migration policies will only exacerbate the situation. Collier has said that it's not a case of whether migration is a good or a bad thing, progressive versus xenophobe, but how much is best to ensure a healthy cultural diversity. But unfortunately, social research is nowhere near the level of sophistication needed to estimate at what point diversity will become seriously costly. But rest assured, left to migrants and without controls, the situation will have a destabilizing effect. So I believe we need to look at the world a bit differently. I believe that 4 steps need to be taken to help address the migration crisis. 1, devise a common language for the migration debate. I was amazed to find out that the international community doesn't even have a definition universally accepted for the word migrant. So let's start there. There are economic migrants, document migrants, irregular migrants, skilled migrants, temporary migrant workers, not to mention refugees and asylum seekers. Step 2, generate proper and complete statistical data. Many countries aren't accurately documenting migrants, and as a result, we cannot make any database decisions. 3 pieces are desperately needed. How fast are the diaspora being absorbed or not into host countries? What is there a ceiling for gross migration? And what type of migrant is on the move? And this last one is particularly important. Do they have a family? How well educated they are? Are they vulnerable? Step 3. Change the mindset of the populations of the host countries to see that migration, albeit controlled, is beneficial and nothing to fear. In fact, it could be argued that their very future prosperity depends on it. The Global Commission on International Migration has reported that in some parts of the world, negative attitudes towards migrants persist, despite the fact that huge sections of their economy depend on foreign labor. And finally, step 4, create a new UN agency with global force. According to Paul Collier again, the problem is that migration has been politicized before it has been analyzed. It is only with a transparent and coordinated migration policy, championed by a UN agency with the global force of law, can we end the disturbing images that we see on our screens every day. What we need is brave, innovative leaders with avant-garde thinking. Thank you.